Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Today we have a great story, so let's get started right now. So, in the fall of 1945, George Orwell actually sits down to write an essay. And if you think about it, the world is literally still digging itself out of the rubble of World War II.
Right, the ink on the surrender documents had basically barely dried at that point.
Exactly. But Orwell isn't, he isn't looking backward at the fascism they had just defeated. He's looking at a newspaper report.
Yeah.
A report about a completely new piece of technology that had just, incinerated 2 Japanese cities.
The atomic bomb.
Right. And staring at the reality of this bomb, he predicts the exact architecture of the next 50 years of your life.
It's pretty incredible.
He describes this world divided between 2 or 3 indestructible superstates, states that possessed weapons so absolute they could never actually use them without committing suicide.
Yeah, he called this looming reality a peace that is no peace.
Which is such a haunting phrase.
It really is. And, he actually coined a term for it in that very same essay. He called it a Cold War.
Wow, right there in 1945.
Right there in 45. And it is genuinely one of the most astonishing instances of political forecasting in modern intellectual history.
I mean, it's just wild.
Years before the geopolitical lines were even drawn on any map, Orwell saw the psychological reality of what happens when absolute power meets mutual vulnerability.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the invisible architecture of the world you interact with every single day, and I mean you, the listener, whether you are, driving to work, checking your smartphone, or watching the news, was built in the shadow of Orwell's prediction.
It's all around us.
It is. When you fire up your internet browser, when you see a rocket launch, when you listen to the vocabulary used in a modern political debate, you are literally walking through the ruins of a very specific, very intense global standoff.
A 40-year staring contest, essentially.
A staring contest where the 2 main adversaries never actually met on a conventional battlefield, but they completely rewired the globe while pointing doomsday weapons at each other's heads.
Yeah, and to understand that wiring, we have to look closely at the mechanics of this conflict, which ran roughly from 1947 to 1991.
The defining paradox is right there in the term cold, isn't it?
Exactly. It was a contest between the United States and the Soviet Union, fought through, every conceivable human endeavor.
Economics, espionage, proxy conflicts.
Right, and cultural warfare.
Yeah.
Everything except direct military engagement. The presence of the nuclear bomb basically acted as a ceiling on the conflict.
Because they knew what would happen if they broke that ceiling.
Right, it prevented World War III. But by capping the violence at the top, it forced all that immense geopolitical pressure outward and downward.
Into every other avenue of global society.
Precisely.
So it's like, if the threat of nuclear annihilation acts as a lid on a pressure cooker, the steam has to escape somewhere.
That's a great way to put it.
It escapes through local proxy wars, through the race to build better technology, through the manipulation of global institutions. The legacy of this peace that is no peace is literally the infrastructure of our current reality.
Yeah, I mean, the United Nations system was forged in this fire.
And the internet. It began as a decentralized defense research network, ARCANET, which was specifically designed to ensure military communications could survive a nuclear strike.
The space race, too. The entire scientific infrastructure of the modern state, it all comes from this era.
Even the map of the world itself, right?
Oh, absolutely. The process of global decolonization, where dozens of nations across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East gained independence from European empires after World War II, was entirely shaped by this superpower competition.
How so?
Well, newly independent nations suddenly found themselves navigating a bipolar world, which gave them a really fascinating kind of leverage.
Oh, I see. They could play them against each other.
Exactly. They could play Washington and Moscow off each other, extracting infrastructure, military aid, and economic support in exchange for their alignment.
It reminds me of 2 massive tech conglomerates trying to corner an emerging market.
Yeah,
They can't legally destroy each other because of antitrust laws, or in this case, mutually assured destruction. So they just ruthlessly try to buy up all the smaller startups.
Undercutting each other's deals.
Right, stealing each other's talent and burning millions just to deny their rival a foothold. It's a vicious, exhausting competition masked under a polite corporate smile.
It is. The constraint at the top level forced all that aggression into the shadows. But to really grasp how bizarre this state of affairs was, we have to look at how incredibly fast these two global rivals went from fighting side by side to, well, plotting each other's destruction.
It's crazy to think about because in 1945, the U.S. and the USSR are allies.
Right.
They are actively coordinating troop movements. They are shaking hands over the ruins of Berlin. And yet, almost the second the Nazis surrender, the alliance evaporates.
It vanishes.
I've always wondered about the psychology of that moment. I mean, if the alliance was strictly a marriage of necessity to defeat Hitler, wasn't this rapid, immediate fallout completely predictable to the people in charge?
Well, the ideological differences were certainly known to the leadership, but the sheer speed of the collapse and the total vacuum of trust that followed was a genuine shock to the system.
Really?
Yeah. To understand why, look at the mechanics of the Yalta Conference in February 1945. You have Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin sitting down to carve up the post-war world.
The big three.
Right. The propaganda of the time presented this as a triumph of Allied unity. But in reality, you had three completely incompatible worldviews forced into the exact same room.
Yeah, I mean, you have American liberal democracy and capitalism, which by its nature requires open markets and free trade to survive.
Exactly.
Then you have the British Empire, desperate to hold on to its colonial possessions despite being essentially economically bankrupted by the war.
And then you have Soviet totalitarianism.
Right, governed by a Marxist-Leninist ideology that inherently believes capitalism is a hostile force destined to try and destroy it.
Plus, Stalin's worldview was deeply informed by Russian history. I mean, Russia had been invaded from the West repeatedly.
Oh, right, Napoleon.
Napoleon, the Germans in World War I, and then devastatingly by Hitler in World War II, which cost the Soviet Union roughly 27 million lives.
27 million. That number is just, it's hard to even comprehend.
It is. So Stalin's paramount goal at Yalta wasn't just spreading communism. It was establishing a massive physical buffer zone of compliant states in Eastern Europe to ensure the Soviet homeland could never be invaded by land again.
So Stalin looks at Eastern Europe and he sees a security blanket.
Right.
But the U.S. and Britain look at Stalin installing puppet regimes in places like Poland and Czechoslovakia, and they see the beginnings of a new tyrannical empire expanding across the globe.
Exactly.
They just defeated one dictator only to watch another swallow half the continent.
And that fundamental asymmetry in perception is exactly what shattered the alliance. The agreements made at Yalta were deliberately vague, relying on phrases like democratic elections.
Which meant entirely different things to Washington and Moscow.
Entirely different things. Once the mutual threat of Nazi Germany was eliminated, the glue holding the alliance together dissolved instantly, leaving a profound security dilemma.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning every defensive move made by one side was interpreted as an offensive threat by the other.
Right. Which brings us to the blueprint for how the United States decided to handle this terrifying new reality.
The famous telegram.
Right. In 1946, a diplomat named George Kennan, who was stationed at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, sends an 8,000-word telegram back to Washington.
Which is a very long telegram.
Yeah, hence the name, the long telegram. And this document, which eventually becomes public as the X article, essentially reprogrammed the entire foreign policy operating system of the United States.
It really did. Kennan provided something the U.S. government desperately needed at that exact moment. A comprehensive psychological and strategic profile of Soviet behavior.
Because they were just confused, right?
Completely deeply confused by Soviet actions. Policymakers in Washington were asking, why were they refusing to join the World Bank? Why were they aggressive in Iran and Turkey?
So what did Kennan tell them?
Kennan argued that Soviet foreign policy was not driven by the rational statecrafts of the previous centuries. He posited that it was driven by a toxic, inseparable combination of traditional Russian imperial insecurity and Marxist-Leninist dogma.
And the dogma basically dictates that capitalist nations are inherently imperialist and will inevitably try to encircle and destroy the communist experiment.
Right.
Therefore, the Soviet Union can never achieve a permanent, peaceful coexistence with the West. It's an ideological impossibility.
Exactly, the conclusion Kennan reached. He argued the Soviet leadership needed the narrative of a hostile outside world to justify their brutal, repressive dictatorship at home.
Oh, so they needed an enemy.
Precisely. Because of this, Kennan wrote, the Soviets would constantly probe outward. They would push like a fluid into every nook and cranny of the globe where they sense weakness or instability.
Like water finding a crack in the foundation.
Exactly. But, and this was the crucial tactical insight, Kennan noted they were highly sensitive to the logic of force. When they encountered firm, unyielding resistance, they would retreat. They were opportunistic, not suicidal.
So Kennan's solution is essentially a geopolitical quarantine.
Yes.
He argues against going to war because that's madness, but he also argues against trying to appease them because they will just interpret that as weakness and take more.
Right.
He proposes a policy of patient, firm containment. You build a metaphorical wall around the Soviet sphere of influence and you just hold the line. You wait them out.
His core theory was that the Soviet system contained internal contradictions. A command economy and a totalitarian political structure stifle innovation and human freedom.
Right. People don't want to live like that.
Exactly. So Kennan theorized that if the United States could successfully contain Soviet expansion for long enough, the internal pressure would eventually cause the Soviet system to either mellow its behavior or collapse under its own weight.
It's a brilliant insight. But I find it deeply ironic that Kennan himself spent the rest of his life arguing that the U.S. government completely misunderstood his idea.
Oh, he was very frustrated by it.
Yeah. I mean, he meant containment as a political and economic strategy. Use diplomacy, use economic aid to rebuild Europe so they don't vote for communist parties. But Washington took his geopolitical quarantine and militarized it to a degree that terrified him.
What's fascinating here is that the militarization happened at a breakneck pace, driven by a series of cascading crises.
Right.
But in 1947, you have the Truman Doctrine, where the U.S. officially commits to providing military and economic assistance to any nation threatened by authoritarian forces, specifically referencing communist uprisings in Greece and Turkey.
And then the economic side kicks into high gear, too.
Yeah, in 1948, the U.S. launches the Marshall Plan, pouring billions of dollars into Western Europe. The goal wasn't just charity. The economic mechanism was designed to restart European industrial engines.
Tying them to the American economy.
Exactly, and making the appeal of communism basically irrelevant.
And Stalin responds to this economic offensive with a physical blockade.
He had to do something.
Right. In 1948, he cuts off all road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin, which was deeply embedded inside Soviet-controlled East Germany. He's essentially holding the civilian population hostage.
Daring the U.S. to act.
Daring them to either start World War III to feed them or abandon the city and prove that American security guarantees are worthless.
And the U.S. response to the Berlin blockade perfectly illustrates the new rules of the Cold War. They didn't send tanks through the checkpoints, which would have sparked a hot war.
Which is what everyone was terrified of.
Right. Instead, they utilized an unprecedented logistical operation. The Berlin airlift.
Oh, this is such a crazy story.
For over a year, American and British cargo planes flew around the clock, landing every 3 minutes in West Berlin.
Every 3 minutes.
Delivering thousands of tons of coal, food, and medicine entirely by air. They bypassed the physical blockade using the third dimension of the sky, forcing Stalin to either shoot the planes down, initiating the war himself, or back down.
Yeah. And eventually, Stalin lifted the blockade.
He did. But the tension from that event forged the permanent military architecture of the West. In 1949, the U.S. and its allies formed NATO, a formal military alliance with the explicit mechanism of collective defense.
Article 5.
Right. An attack on one is an attack on all. And then the ultimate shock to the system happened. Later that same year, the Soviet Union successfully detonates its first atomic bomb.
The American monopoly on nuclear weapons was over.
Years before their intelligence agencies predicted it would be. The overarching structure of the Cold War was now entirely locked into place.
Two massive alliances, ideologically opposed, structurally militarized, and both possessing the capacity for total destruction.
It's a terrifying setup.
It really is. And this locks us into a terrifying structural logic. If containment is the official policy and direct warfare is off the table because of the atomic bomb, how does this standoff end up killing millions of people in places thousands of miles away from the US or the USSR.
That's the real tragedy here.
The logic of containment seems defensive, but the reality was intensely bloody.
This is the tragic mechanism of the proxy war.
Huh.
The Cold War established a zero-sum global chessboard.
Meaning what?
A zero-sum game means that any gain for one side is mathematically a proportionate loss for the other. There were no neutral events. None. If a country in Southeast Asia or Latin America or Africa underwent a domestic political revolution, it wasn't viewed by Washington or Moscow as a local issue about land reform or post-colonial independence.
Right.
It was viewed strictly through the lens of the superpower competition.
So if a socialist-leaning government takes power in a small developing nation, Washington doesn't just see a change in local economic policy, they see a breach in the containment wall.
Exactly.
They see a strategic outpost handed directly to Moscow, and Moscow operates on the exact same paranoia in reverse.
Precisely. This structural paranoia triggered interventions worldwide. Both superpowers sought to bleed the enemy and impose massive costs without ever crossing the threshold into direct nuclear-armed confrontation.
So they get other people to fight for them.
They would fund, arm, and train local forces to do the fighting and dying for them.
The first time this loophole in the apocalypse was exploited on a massive scale was the Korean War, starting in 1950.
Yeah.
The Korean peninsula had been divided after World War II, with the Soviet-backed North and the U.S.-backed South. When North Korean forces poured across the 38th parallel to reunify the country by force, it was the ultimate test of containment.
And the United States, operating under the UN banner, intervened to prevent the collapse of the South. But the Korean War demonstrated the terrifying mechanics of limited warfare in the nuclear age.
How so?
Well, when U.S. forces pushed the North Koreans back toward the Chinese border, Communist China, backed by Soviet logistics and air support, sent hundreds of thousands of troops across the Yalu River, driving the Americans back down the peninsula.
And this is where the nuclear ceiling is tested. You have American troops actively engaged in massive, brutal combat against Chinese forces.
And Soviet pilots are secretly flying fighter jets against American planes.
Right. And yet, Washington decides not to use the atomic bomb. They accept a conventional stalemate, rather than risk escalating to a global nuclear exchange.
The conflict ended in 1953 with an armistice that essentially restored the pre-war borders. But the human toll was staggering.
Unbelievable numbers.
An estimated 2.5 million military and civilian casualties. Geopolitically, the Korean War established a chilling precedent. It proved to both superpowers that they could orchestrate and participate in massive, highly destructive, conventional wars on the periphery of their empires without triggering mutual assured destruction.
They figured out the rules of the game. We can kill each other's soldiers, we can bomb proxy nations back to the Stone Age as long as we don't march on Moscow or Washington.
Yeah, that realization directly paves the road to the tragedy of Vietnam.
Vietnam represents the most consequential and systemic failure of the containment strategy for the United States. It was driven by a specific mechanical offshoot of containment known as the domino theory.
The idea that nations are lined up like dominoes.
Right. If you let one fall to communism, say, South Vietnam, the geopolitical momentum will cause the neighboring country Laos to fall, then Cambodia, then Thailand, until the entire economic sphere of Southeast Asia is absorbed into the Soviet orbit, threatening major allies like Japan.
That was the strategic theory. But it was compounded by a severe domestic political mechanism in the U.S., the fear of losing credibility.
Which is always a huge driver in politics.
Absolutely. No administration, from Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson to Nixon, wanted to be the one responsible for losing Vietnam to the communists.
So they just kept doubling down.
Involvement escalated gradually. It started with financial aid to the French colonial forces, then military advisors to the South Vietnamese government, and eventually a massive deployment of American ground combat troops and the most intense bombing campaigns in human history.
But the fundamental failure in Vietnam wasn't a lack of firepower. It was a failure to understand the actual nature of the conflict. The U.S. was attempting to apply conventional warfare mechanics, measuring success by territory held and enemy body counts, to a complex post-colonial civil war.
The strategic miscalculations were profound. Washington viewed the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong entirely as proxies for Moscow and Beijing. They failed to recognize that for the Vietnamese forces, this was primarily a war of national liberation.
Right, they were fighting for their home.
Exactly. Their pain tolerance, their willingness to absorb casualties to achieve independence and unification, vastly exceeded what the American public was willing to tolerate for an abstract geopolitical theory.
You can't bomb a nationalist ideology out of a jungle.
You really can't.
The U.S. was propping up a South Vietnamese government that struggled with immense corruption and often lacked legitimacy in the eyes of its own rural population. No amount of helicopter gunships can artificially generate political legitimacy.
And the toll was catastrophic. Over 58,000 Americans died, and estimates suggest 2 to 3 million Vietnamese perished.
It's just devastating.
The war fractured American society, triggered massive domestic unrest, and severely damaged global American credibility. Furthermore, declassified documents later revealed a deeply cynical reality.
What did they show?
That senior officials in the Johnson administration recognized early on that the war was likely unwinnable, yet they continued to escalate it simply because the political cost of withdrawing was deemed too high.
It's a terrifying momentum. The logic of the Cold War created a trap where saving face became more important than saving lives.
It really did.
But the United States wasn't the only superpower to fall into the counterinsurgency trap. A decade later, the Soviet Union marched into its own catastrophic proxy war.
The Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, beginning in December 1979, mirrored the American experience in Vietnam in eerie ways.
The parallels are wild.
The Soviets invaded to prop up a floundering communist government in Kabul that was facing a widespread rural rebellion. Moscow feared that if Afghanistan fell to Islamic fundamentalism, it would destabilize the Soviet republics in Central Asia.
So they used the Brezhnev Doctrine.
Right. They invoked the Brezhnev Doctrine, the principle that Moscow had the right to intervene militarily in any allied country where socialism was threatened.
But they marched their conventional military machine into a mountainous terrain against decentralized, highly motivated guerrilla fighters, the Mujahideen.
Yeah.
And this is where the U.S. sees an opportunity to give the Soviets a taste of their own medicine. The CIA launches Operation Cyclone.
It became one of the longest and most expensive covert operations in CIA history. The mechanism was indirect. The U.S. funneled billions of dollars in weapons and funding through Pakistan's intelligence services to the Afghan resistance.
And the weapons were key.
The most famous technological intervention was the Stinger anti-aircraft missile. By placing these shoulder-fired missiles into the hands of guerrilla fighters, the U.S. neutralized the Soviet advantage in air power, specifically their lethal Hind helicopter gunships.
The cost to the Soviet Union was devastating. Over 15,000 Soviet soldiers killed, tens of thousands wounded, and a massive drain on an economy that was already starting to creak under the strain of the arms race.
But the cost to Afghanistan was apocalyptic.
Right.
Over 1 million Afghan civilians killed, millions more turned into refugees.
The Afghan war became a bleeding ulcer that significantly contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet system. But the legacy of this specific proxy war is perhaps the most stark example of historical blowback we have.
Absolutely.
The strategy of funneling money and radicalizing literature to disparate militant fundamentalist groups to fight the Soviets succeeded in its immediate Cold War objective. But once the Soviets withdrew and the Cold War ended, those armed radicalized networks didn't just disappear.
No, they didn't. They morphed. They utilized the training, the logistics networks, and the weapons they acquired during the proxy war and directed them against the West.
You can draw a straight, undeniable line from the mechanics of Cold War containment in Afghanistan to the creation of al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and the defining global conflicts of the 21st century.
It perfectly illustrates the extreme danger of treating sovereign nations purely as instrumental tools for a larger geopolitical game. But behind all of this proxy violence, behind the chess moves in Asia and the Middle East, the fundamental nature of the Cold War was dictated by something far more elemental, the absolute terror of the nuclear shadow.
I try to imagine the psychology of living through that era. We talk about it now as history, but for 4 decades, every single human being on Earth lived with the genuine possibility that human civilization could end on a random Tuesday afternoon.
It's a heavy burden to carry.
If a radar malfunctioned or a flock of geese was misidentified as an incoming bomber fleet, the retaliation sequence would launch, and within 45 minutes, every major city in the Northern Hemisphere would be glass.
The existential tension was absolute. And it fundamentally altered the psychology of statecraft. The strategy that emerged to manage this terror was known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD.
An appropriate acronym.
Very appropriate. The mechanical logic of AAD is incredibly morbid. It posits that the only way to prevent a nuclear war is to ensure that both sides possess the capability to completely annihilate the other. even after absorbing a surprise first strike.
So, if the Soviets launch a surprise attack and destroy Washington and all our land-based missile silos, we need to have nuclear submarines hiding deep in the oceans, completely undetectable, with enough firepower to turn Moscow to ash.
Right.
You have to ensure they know that killing you means killing themselves.
It requires a perfect, uninterrupted chain of deterrence. The theory requires both actors to be perfectly rational and in complete control of their command structures.
Which is asking a lot of human beings.
It is. Human systems are rarely perfect. And that theoretical architecture was put to the ultimate, terrifying test in October 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
13 days where the world literally held its breath. American spy planes flying over Cuba take photographs revealing that the Soviet Union is constructing launch sites for medium-range nuclear ballistic missiles.
Missiles that are located just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
Why did they do it?
Well, to understand the Soviet calculus, we have to look at the strategic balance of power at the time. The United States had a massive advantage in the number of nuclear warheads and delivery systems. Furthermore, the U.S. had placed Jupiter nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey, right on the Soviet border.
Oh, so they were already feeling surrounded.
Yes. The Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, essentially decided to level the playing field by putting missiles in America's backyard. He also wanted to deter the U.S. from attempting another invasion of Cuba to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government.
But for President Kennedy, this is an intolerable breach of containment. It drastically cuts down the warning time of a nuclear strike from perhaps 30 minutes for an ICBM from Russia to a matter of minutes from Cuba.
Kennedy's military advisors, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, push heavily for an immediate, massive airstrike to destroy the sites, followed by a full-scale invasion of the island.
And if he had listened to them.
Had Kennedy authorized that invasion, we now know from Soviet archives that the local Soviet commanders in Cuba had the authority to use tactical nuclear weapons against the invading American forces. The escalation to a global nuclear exchange would have been almost inevitable.
Instead, Kennedy opts for a slightly less aggressive but incredibly tense mechanism. He announces a naval quarantine of Cuba.
Because calling it a blockade is technically an act of war, so they use a different word.
Right. The U.S. Navy forms a ring of ships around the island to prevent any more Soviet military equipment from arriving. And then we just watch Soviet cargo ships steam toward the American blockade line.
The tension was agonizing. At one point, a Soviet submarine being harassed by U.S. Navy depth charges, which the Americans were using as signals to surface, but the cut-off Soviet crew, interpreted as an attack, came within one single officer's veto of launching a nuclear torpedo at the American fleet.
Wait, really? One guy?
One guy. The officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to agree to the launch. That single act of restraint arguably saved human civilization.
That is just wow. Eventually, the standoff is resolved, but it requires a very delicate geopolitical dance. There's the public deal, where Khrushchev agrees to dismantle the missiles in Cuba, and the U.S. publicly pledges never to invade the island.
But that wouldn't have been enough for Khrushchev to sell to his own hardliners in Moscow. He needed a concession.
Which brings us to the secret mechanism of the deal. Through back-channel negotiations managed by the president's brother, Robert Kennedy, and the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrinin, the United States secretly agreed to remove its aging Jupiter missiles from Turkey in the months following the crisis.
It was a face-saving exit ramp that allowed both leaders to step back from the abyss while claiming a strategic victory to their respective domestic audiences.
Coming that close to the edge changes both sides. They look into the abyss and they realize the system they've built is too dangerous to rely purely on fear. They realize you can't just hope deterrence works, you have to actively manage it.
The Cuban Missile Crisis catalyzed a profound shift in how the superpowers interacted. The immediate mechanical fix was the establishment of the Moscow-Washington hotline.
The famous red phone.
Exactly. A direct, secure teleprinter link between the Kremlin and the Pentagon. During the crisis, diplomatic messages were taking hours to encode, transmit, translate, and deliver. In the nuclear age, an hours-long delay could mean the end of the world.
But beyond the hotline, they recognized they needed a bureaucracy for survival. They needed arms control. And over the next 3 decades, they painstakingly negotiated a web of highly technical treaties designed to stabilize the balance of terror.
The mechanics of these treaties are fascinating because they required verification between two entities that intrinsically distrusted one another. You couldn't just take the enemy's word that they were dismantling weapons.
Trust but verify.
Right. This led to the reliance on national technical means. A diplomatic euphemism for spy satellites and sophisticated radar.
Right. If you signed the SALT treaties in the 1970s, which capped the number of nuclear delivery vehicles, you verify it by counting their missile silos from space. But the treaty that really exposes the paradoxical logic of the era is the ABM Treaty in 1972, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty.
The ABM Treaty is the perfect embodiment of Cold War logic. It strictly limited the number of defensive missile shields either side could build. It seems completely counterintuitive. Why would you sign a treaty making it illegal to defend your own cities from a nuclear attack?
Because if one side successfully builds a shield that can shoot down incoming missiles, the balance of mutually assured destruction is broken.
Exactly.
If you know the enemy's retaliatory strike will bounce off your shield, you might be tempted to launch a first strike. Defenselessness was literally the cornerstone of strategic stability.
That treaty, along with others, like the INF Treaty, which eliminated intermediate-range missiles in Europe, provided a crucial mathematical predictability to the arms race. It ensured neither side felt pressured to launch out of fear that the other had achieved a sudden strategic breakout.
It's all about managing the paranoia.
Yes. And it is alarming to note, as our sources point out, that in the post-Cold War era, much of this painstakingly constructed architecture has been dismantled. The U.S. withdrew from the ABM Treaty in 2002, and the INF Treaty collapsed recently. The guardrails, built by the generation that survived the Cuban Missile Crisis, have largely been removed.
We took down the guardrails because we thought the road was finally straight. But while the superpowers were carefully managing their doomsday arsenals, they were fighting a completely different kind of war on the ground. Because the nuclear shadow made the battlefield unusable, the conflict had to find a new medium. It became a war of seduction. It became a battle for the cultural soul of the world.
This ideological dimension is crucial. The Cold War wasn't just a contest over territory. It was a fundamental debate over which system of human organization could deliver the better life.
The good life.
Right. The Soviet Union invested heavily in cultural propaganda. They promoted the narrative that capitalism was inherently exploitative, culturally bankrupt, and soul-crushing, whereas Soviet socialism produced a scientifically enlightened, highly cultured society. They sent ballet troupes and classical musicians around the globe.
So the CIA decides they can't let the Soviets win the culture war. But this is where the history reads like a surreal spy novel. Frances Stoner Saunders detailed this in her book, The Cultural Cold War. We usually think of the CIA as organizing coups or arming rebels, but during the 1950s and 60s, the CIA was secretly funding abstract, expressionist painters and literary magazines.
The CIA established a massive covert program of cultural patronage, most notably channeled through an organization called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The strategic logic was subtle. In Western Europe, particularly in places like France and Italy, there was a strong intellectual affinity for communism among writers and artists. The CIA needed to pull the European intelligentsia away from Moscow.
So they didn't fund pro-American propaganda. They funded art that showcased freedom. They secretly bankrolled exhibitions of Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko.
Yeah, the abstract stuff.
Right, because abstract expressionism is chaotic, individualistic, and completely indecipherable. It was the exact opposite of the rigid, state-mandated socialist realism art coming out of the Soviet Union.
Exactly. The mechanism was to demonstrate that Western liberal democracy allowed for boundless, unconstrained human expression while the Soviet system crushed it. The CIA funneled money through philanthropic foundations to sponsor literary journals like Encounter in London, arts festivals, and even international tours of the Boston Symphony Orchestra.
Okay, but I have to point out the absolute glaring contradiction here. The CIA is secretly manipulating and heavily subsidizing artists and writers to prove how free, independent, and organic Western culture is compared to Soviet state control. Isn't the act of secretly controlling the narrative proof that the culture isn't actually free?
It is a profound paradox that strikes at the heart of the Cold War's moral compromises. When these covert funding mechanisms were eventually exposed in the late 1960s, it devastated the intellectual community.
I can imagine.
Many of the writers and artists involved genuinely believed they were independent voices. Discovering that their platform was secretly subsidized by a spy agency pursuing a geopolitical agenda forced a painful reckoning. It raises enduring questions about the autonomy of civil society when national security interests decide to utilize culture as a weapon.
It's like finding out that your favorite underground anti-establishment punk band was actually a corporate focus group project funded by a massive marketing firm.
Right, exactly.
But from the covert shadows of art galleries, The superpowers also sought to prove their systemic superiority on the largest, most spectacular public stage imaginable, the space race.
If the cultural Cold War was covert, the space race was explicitly designed for maximum global visibility. And it began with a profound shock to the American psyche. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union successfully launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into low Earth orbit.
It was just a polished metal sphere the size of a beach ball with a radio transmitter that emitted a simple beep, beep, beep. But the psychological impact of that beep broadcasting over American skies was monumental.
The impact was driven by the underlying mechanics of the achievement. The United States had long assumed that its scientific and industrial base was peerless.
And the Soviets were just behind.
The Soviet Union was viewed as backwards and largely agrarian. For the Soviets to achieve orbit first shattered the American narrative of technological supremacy. Furthermore, the rocket that launched Sputnik, the R-7, was an intercontinental ballistic missile.
Which changes everything.
The strategic implication was terrifyingly clear. If the Soviets possessed a rocket powerful enough to put a satellite into orbit, they possessed a rocket capable of delivering a nuclear warhead to New York or Washington.
The Soviet system looked like it was genuinely out-innovating the capitalist world. And they follow it up by putting a dog in space, and then in 1961, the ultimate flex. Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human being to orbit the Earth. The Soviet narrative that communism is the scientifically superior system of the future is writing itself.
Which is why the American response had to be equally monumental. When President John F. Kennedy stood up and committed the United States to landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade, it wasn't a mandate born primarily of a desire for scientific exploration.
It was geopolitical.
It was an urgent geopolitical necessity. The Apollo program was a mechanism to visibly mobilize the vast industrial, economic, and organizational might of the American capitalist system and focus it on a single, universally comprehensible goal.
It was the ultimate demonstration of project management and resource allocation. And when Neil Armstrong steps onto the lunar surface in July 1969, it decisively reclaims the technological narrative for the West. It proved that when mobilized, the American system could outbuild and out-innovate the command economy.
But the sheer scale of this competition, the space race, the massive nuclear arsenals, the constant funding of proxy wars around the globe was economically and psychologically exhausting for both sides. By the late 1960s, both Washington and Moscow recognized that the current trajectory was unsustainable.
The bills were coming due.
The Soviet economy was beginning to stagnate, and the United States was tearing itself apart internally over the Vietnam War.
They needed a pressure valve. They needed to hit the brakes before the engines exploded. This ushers in the era of détente.
Détente, a French term meaning the relaxation of strained relations, defined the geopolitical architecture of the 1970s. Championed by Richard Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger on the U.S. side, and Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev on the other.
So what was the goal?
The philosophy of détente was a shift away from the existential crusade to destroy the enemy, toward a pragmatic acceptance that the Soviet Union was a permanent fixture on the global stage.
They realize they are stuck on a lifeboat together, and if one tries to kill the other, the boat sinks, so they might as well establish some traffic laws. They negotiate arms control treaties like salt size, they increase trade, they even launch a joint Apollo-Soyuz space mission where American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts dock in space and shake hands.
But underneath the handshakes and the treaties, Nixon and Kissinger were executing one of the most sophisticated strategic maneuvers of the entire Cold War. Triangular diplomacy.
Okay, this is fascinating.
For 2 decades, Washington had treated global communism as a monolith, assuming that Moscow and Beijing operated in lockstep. But beneath the surface, the Sino-Soviet alliance had fractured.
The Soviet Union and Communist China had a massive ideological falling out in the 1960s. They disagreed over the true interpretation of Marxism, and their massive shared border became highly contested. In 1969, Soviet and Chinese troops actually engage in bloody border skirmishes along the Ussuri River. They are practically at war with each other.
Kissinger recognized the mechanics of this split offered the United States a profound strategic opportunity. The logic of triangular diplomacy was brilliant in its ruthless pragmatism. If the U.S. could normalize relations with Communist China, it would radically alter the global balance of power.
Because it isolates the Soviets.
Exactly. A U.S.-China rapprochement would spark immense strategic paranoia in Moscow. The Soviets would suddenly face the nightmare scenario of a hostile China on their eastern border, aligned with a hostile America in the West.
To prevent that encirclement, the Soviets would be forced to be much more accommodating and cooperative with Washington. It's geopolitical leverage at its finest. So Kissinger orchestrates secret communications, culminating in a clandestine flight to Beijing in 1971 to lay the groundwork, followed by Nixon's historic, highly publicized visit to China in 1972.
By playing the China card, the U.S. successfully extracted concessions from Moscow, including progress on arms control. It managed the superpower competition effectively for a decade. But détente was inherently fragile.
It didn't last.
No, it didn't resolve the underlying ideological incompatibility. It merely managed the symptoms. And by the end of the 1970s, the traffic laws broke down completely.
The final nail in the coffin of détente was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979. President Jimmy Carter calls it the greatest threat to peace since World War II. He withdraws the SALT II treaty from the Senate, boycotts the 1980 Moscow Olympics, and the era of polite management is over. We swing right back into the deep freeze.
This sets the stage for the 1980s and the profound shift initiated by the Reagan administration. Ronald Reagan campaigned on the belief that détente was a moral and strategic failure that had allowed the Soviet Union to gain ground globally while America retreated. Once in office, his administration implemented an aggressive rollback strategy.
The tone shifts dramatically. Reagan publicly calls the Soviet Union an evil empire. He abandons the pragmatic realism of Kissinger and returns to the moral clarity and existential danger of the early Cold War.
The mechanics of the Reagan strategy operated on multiple fronts. Economically and militarily, he initiated the largest peacetime defense buildup in American history. He pushed the development of the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, a proposed space-based missile shield that threatened to fundamentally upend the logic of mutually assured destruction.
Because it threatened their deterrent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He also implemented the Reagan Doctrine, which moved beyond Kennan's containment by actively funding and arming anti-communist insurgencies globally, from Nicaragua to Angola to Afghanistan, seeking to actively push Soviet influence backward.
Now, this triggers one of the fiercest debates among historians. Did Reagan's massive pressure campaign actually win the Cold War? Did he force the Soviets into an arms race they simply couldn't afford, effectively bankrupting their system? I've heard it described as a poker game where Reagan looks at the Soviet hand, knows they are bluffing with a weak economy, and just shoves all his chips to the center of the table, forcing them to fold.
That is the narrative often favored by proponents of the Reagan administration. They argue that the external pressure exacerbated the internal vulnerabilities of the Soviet system, accelerating its collapse. However, a significant body of historical scholarship argues that this perspective gives too much credit to American policy and fundamentally misunderstands the internal mechanics of the Soviet decline.
What's the counterargument?
The counterargument focuses on the structural reality of the Soviet economy. By the 1970s and 80s, the Soviet command economy was experiencing severe stagnation. A system designed to build steel plants and tractors in the 1930s was completely incapable of adapting to the information age and the microchip revolution of the 1980s.
They just couldn't keep up.
Furthermore, the Soviet economy was heavily dependent on exporting oil. When global oil prices plummeted in the 1980s, the financial floor fell out from under Moscow. Many historians argue the system was dying of its own internal systemic contradictions, just as George Kennan had predicted 40 years earlier, and would have collapsed regardless of Reagan's rhetoric or military spending.
So it's less like Reagan pushed the building over and more like the building's foundation had already dissolved and Reagan just happened to be leaning against it when it finally fell.
That's a good way to look at it.
But regardless of the cause, the end of this standoff came with a speed that absolutely stunned the entire world. Which brings us to the unthinkable collapse.
The dissolution of the Soviet Union between 1989 and 1991 is perhaps the most dramatic, unexpected, and peaceful collapse of a major empire in recorded history. We are talking about the vanishing of a superpower that spanned 11 time zones, maintained a massive standing army, and possessed tens of thousands of nuclear weapons.
And what I find absolutely fascinating is the colossal intelligence failure surrounding this event. The CIA had thousands of analysts, billions of dollars in spy satellites, and entire university departments dedicated to Sovietology. And they almost universally missed it.
They really did.
In 1988, just a year before the Berlin Wall falls, the consensus was that the Soviet Union was struggling, sure, but it was a permanent, stable fixture of the international order. How do thousands of experts miss the collapse of an empire?
They missed it because they were measuring the wrong metrics.
Sure.
Western intelligence was highly adept at counting Soviet tanks, missile silos, and steel production. They measured the hard power. but they failed to accurately measure the systemic rot within the social contract.
The psychological aspect.
Right. They couldn't quantify the profound ideological exhaustion of the Soviet populace, and critically, the total loss of faith among the Communist Party elites themselves. The system looked structurally sound from the outside because the facade was maintained by fear and inertia, not actual belief or economic vitality.
And the man who accidentally pulls the linchpin on this entire hollow structure is Mikhail Gorbachev. The great paradox of the late Cold War is that the man who destroyed the Soviet system was the one who was desperately trying to save it.
Gorbachev ascended to the leadership in 1985. He recognized the profound economic stagnation and the moral decay of the system. He believed that to save Soviet socialism, he needed to inject it with flexibility and accountability. He introduced two famous reform mechanisms: perestroika, which meant economic restructuring, and glasnost, which meant openness or transparency.
But the mechanics of those reforms acted like poison to a totalitarian system. Let's look at the economics first. A command economy works by having a central bureaucracy in Moscow dictate exactly how many shoes a factory will make and exactly what price those shoes will sell for. There is no supply and demand. Gorbachev introduces perestroika to give factory managers more freedom to make decisions, but he doesn't fully transition to a market economy.
It created an economic disaster. He dismantled the rigid command structures that forced the system to function, however inefficiently, but he didn't replace them with the price mechanisms of a free market. Factory managers stopped following state orders, but had no market signals to guide them.
So they didn't know what to make.
The supply chains instantly disintegrated. Basic consumer goods vanished. The economic distress of the average Soviet citizen rapidly worsened under perestroika.
And while their economic lives are collapsing, Gorbachev introduces glasnost. He opens the windows and says, let's talk honestly about our history and our problems. But when you lift the lid on a society that has suppressed truth and grievance with the secret police for 70 years, you don't get constructive criticism. You get an explosion.
Glasnost fundamentally destroyed the legitimacy of the Communist Party. Once the media was allowed to report honestly, the public was flooded with revelations about the scale of Stalin's purges, the man-made famines, the horrific environmental degradation, and the systemic corruption of the elite.
It was too much truth at once.
A pivotal mechanism of this disillusionment was the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986. The state's initial instinct to cover up a radioactive cloud spreading over Europe proved to the Soviet populace that the system was fundamentally mendacious and incompetent.
So the economy is broken, the ideological narrative is shattered, and the only thing that historically held the Soviet bloc together was the threat of Soviet tanks rolling through your city if you rebelled. And this is Gorbachev's final, fatal, but arguably noble decision. When the people of Eastern Europe start rising up, he refuses to use the military to crush them.
Historically, when Hungary tried to break away in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968, Moscow sent in the armored divisions and crushed the uprisings.
Yeah.
The satellite states were held in orbit by the gravitational pull of fear. But in 1989, Gorbachev essentially announced the Sinatra Doctrine: they could do it their way. He signaled that the Soviet army would stay in its barracks.
The moment the fear of the tanks vanishes, the entire empire disintegrates almost overnight. The timeline is a blur. In November 1989, a confused East German bureaucrat makes a mistake at a press conference, accidentally announcing that the borders to West Berlin are open immediately. Thousands of East Berliners rush the checkpoints.
And the guards didn't shoot.
The guards, having no orders to shoot, just let them through. The Berlin Wall falls.
This triggered the rapid, largely peaceful Velvet revolutions across Eastern Europe. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria. Within months, the communist regimes collapsed and were replaced by democratic governments. The outer empire was gone.
But then it comes for the core.
And then the rot spread to the core. The individual republics within the Soviet Union itself, the Baltics, Ukraine, Georgia, began demanding independence.
In August 1991, communist hardliners in the military and the KGB realize the empire is dissolving. They attempt a coup against Gorbachev, putting him under house arrest. But it's too late. The Soviet public, led by figures like Boris Yeltsin, refuses to submit. The military refuses to fire on the crowds in Moscow. The coup collapses in 3 days, and with it, the final remaining authority of the Communist Party.
The mechanism of state power had completely evaporated. One by one, the republics declared independence. And on December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin, and the tricolor flag of the Russian Federation was raised. The Soviet Union ceased to exist in international law.
A 4-decade global conflict that threatened to extinguish human life in a radioactive firestorm ended with a piece of paper and a flag lowering. It's almost hard to process. The physical empire is gone. But the invisible architecture, the software that this conflict installed in our world is still running. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the actual words coming out of our mouths.
The linguistic legacy of the Cold War is profound. It didn't just reshape maps. It permanently rewired the English language. We utilize vocabulary every day that is entirely a product of this specific ideological standoff.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Think about the word superpower. Before the mid-20th century, history had great powers, the British Empire, the French, the Ottomans. But the unique condition of having global logistical reach backed by the capacity to end civilization required a new linguistic category.
It did.
We use superpower casually now to describe a tech monopoly or a dominant athlete, but the word was literally forged in the fires of atomic diplomacy.
The era also popularized terms that describe the mechanisms of tension, brinkmanship, the art of pushing a dangerous situation to the absolute limit of safety to force your opponent to concede. We use it to describe political negotiations in Congress today. Domino theory, proxy war.
And the military-industrial complex.
The phrase military-industrial complex, which President Eisenhower coined in his 1961 farewell address to warn the American public about the domestic political influence of the permanent arms industry that the Cold War necessitated.
We use the acronym MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction, which perfectly captures the insanity of the logic. We talk about McCarthyism to describe reckless, unsubstantiated accusations of treason, named after the senator who weaponized the domestic fear of communism. But the linguistic shift that I find most fascinating is the term Third World.
The evolution of the term Third World is a perfect example of how the Cold War warped our understanding of global geography. Today, it is commonly, though somewhat controversially, used to denote countries that are economically underdeveloped, but its original genesis was purely geopolitical.
Right. During the Cold War, you had the First World, which was the United States and its industrialized, capitalist, democratic allies in Western Europe and Japan. Then you had the Second World, which was the Soviet Union, China, and the Communist bloc.
And the Third World originally described the nations of the non-aligned movement. These were primarily post-colonial nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America that explicitly sought to chart an independent path and refused to formally align militarily with either Washington or Moscow.
So it was political.
It was a political designation of neutrality, not an economic measurement. But because many of those non-aligned nations were grappling with the legacy of colonialism and facing severe economic challenges, the term gradually shifted in the popular consciousness from a political category to a synonym for poverty.
But the Cold War didn't just give us specific nouns and adjectives. It fundamentally shaped the register of modern political rhetoric. It trained generations of politicians and citizens to view global affairs through a highly specific, binary lens.
It embedded a habit of framing complex, multifaceted geopolitical issues as fundamental existential conflicts between absolute moral categories. The rhetoric of the Cold War continually framed the struggle as freedom versus tyranny, democracy versus totalitarianism, or good versus evil.
If a local civil war breaks out over water rights or land reform, we don't analyze the local historical context. We immediately map our binary template onto it. Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? Which side represents freedom?
This rhetorical heritage is a persistent, often unhelpful feature of contemporary political discourse. When modern leaders invoke the language of existential struggle to describe trade disputes or regional rivalries, they're utilizing the software coded during that 40-year standoff. Understanding that this binary language was forged as a psychological weapon for a very specific historical moment is crucial for intelligently engaging with the multipolar complexities of the world today.
Okay, let's take a step back and look at the whole picture. What an incredible, terrifying journey. We started with George Orwell peering through the smoke of Hiroshima, predicting a peace that is no peace. We watched the uneasy alliance of World War II shatter, creating a vacuum that was filled by the doctrine of containment.
We saw how the prohibition on direct conflict forced the superpowers to fight through devastating proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, establishing the tragic mechanics of modern intervention.
We looked into the abyss of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the logic of mutually assured destruction almost failed, and examined the sprawling architecture of arms control treaties required to manage that terror.
We observed the bizarre paradoxes of the cultural Cold War, with intelligence agencies secretly funding abstract art, and the soaring geopolitical ambition of the space race. We discussed the calculated pragmatism of détente and triangular diplomacy.
And finally, we witnessed the sudden, unthinkable collapse of the Soviet behemoth. A collapse triggered not by an American missile, but by the systemic contradictions of its own economy and the accidental consequences of Gorbachev opening a window to let in some fresh air.
It is a profound reminder that the geopolitical systems we perceive as permanent are often highly fragile, heavily reliant on internal coherence and the psychology of the populations that sustain them.
Which brings us back to our opening thought. We started by looking at the invisible architecture all around us, the borders, the institutions, the vocabulary. But I want to leave you, the listener, with a lingering question to think about long after this deep dive ends. We talked heavily about the massive intelligence failure of the late 1980s. Thousands of the smartest analysts on Earth with limitless resources looked at the Soviet Union in 1988 and measured its tanks and its missiles and concluded it was a permanent, stable fixture of reality. They completely failed to see that the social contract was eaten by termites and the whole structure was hollow.
They mistook a rigid, heavily armed facade for genuine structural integrity.
So as you look at the world today, at the news notifications popping up on your phone, given that massive historical blind spot, what supposedly permanent global structures or political systems or even modern superpower rivalries today are actually completely hollow on the inside, just waiting for a change in the wind to collapse into dust. Think about it.